Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. We're here today to talk about World Suicide Prevention Day, and I just wanted to get your opinion on the change in language surrounding suicide, because we used to say commit suicide and now we say death by suicide, or someone's killed themselves. Why do you think this change in language is important?
Well, I think this. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's honestly a huge honour, and I think the Royal College of Psychiatry do an amazing job. And I think you're great advocates for, of course, of this space, but in a really positive way. So I just want to say thank you first of all. I think the language is incredibly important, and I think we should talk about on different levels, not just about around the word suicide, but actually emotional literacy. I think in mental health language in general. But when we look at the term suicide in the past, saying committed suicide, now we've changed to like death by suicide, for example, or died by suicide. It's really important because it's such a heavily laden word to say committed. In 1961 they changed the Suicide Act. They changed that language because previously it was seen to be a crime to attempt to take your own life, or and if you were found to have attempted to take your own life, it was something that could be punishable by prison. And it's kind of really, really shocking. I think a lot of people don't realise that is the case, and that's really what it means when we're saying committed suicide. And the message that can send to people who feel suicidal or feel really low or have had suicidal ideation is really, really profound. And I have had patients say to me in A&E, when they've said that they felt, kind of suicidal, they've said that, they've heard healthcare professionals using the word committed, and the way that can make them feel. So it's really important that we're kind of really aware of what we're saying and the impact that can have. And I think if you extend it and use it in different scenarios as well, people saying things like patient is bipolar, that patient is bipolar, or XYZ name is bipolar. They're not defined by the illness. They are this person who has a diagnosis of bipolar, and just categorizing, make people feel laden by that diagnosis is just simply isn't fair. It's like saying diabetic patient. It's not. It's a patient who has diabetes, for example. And I think it's just really important to do that. And a big part of stigma around mental health is this kind of labeling. I think that happens a lot of the time, this feeling that you become a diagnosis, which is not true. And there's some amazing people that, and I guess the big thing about that as well is that the feeling that, okay, am I now this diagnosis? I can't be successful or be happy or do things in life and achieve my goals. Well, actually, a lot of people do manage to do that. And as I've got a colleague who works for me, a consultant, actually very good friends with, and she has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And she's an incredible consultant. She's very open about having that, but she's not defined by it. And I think that's what's really important about language, and particularly when we're talking about the word, committed suicide. And I think, for me personally, obviously, well, when my brother took his own life just over a year ago, that to me, he didn't commit a crime. He suffered with an illness, and there's a big difference. Yeah, I think hugely. And if you actually look at what we're trying to do at schools now, is start integrating emotional literacy, at an early age, a very almost basic literacy of, what are thoughts, what are feelings, what's emotion, why do behaviors sometimes link to inner feelings and emotions, and what's the connection, what do we do about it? And I think starting at a young age and helping people understand how to vocalize in the right way what they're experiencing and expressing things in the right way is so important. And a big part of, I think, some of the issues that we have around mental illness in particular, and vocalizing it and expressing them, in I guess more broad sense of how we feel in terms of health and well-being. I think in the barriers in emotional literacy is a huge issue, and I believe strongly, I wouldn't be doing the role that I'm doing if I didn't. I believe strongly that education is a very powerful tool, and that through education we can change things like the way that we use language and help people use the right language and understand what words mean and how to convey what they're feeling really well. I think it's like kind of evolution in some ways. I mean, a lot of the medical words and terminology we use, it just creates barriers sometimes, and we use fancy words for things when you can just explain them in much more simpler terms. And I think that, you know, when we speak to patients, you know, the way that we talk about things and talking on a level with someone, I think, is very important as well. So from that perspective, even just that doctor-patient relationship, it's, you know, let's level with people and speak to them in a way that's understand, you know, people can understand, and as I say, avoid labeling terms, really.
Some medical literature, a lot of medical literature was created a really, really long time ago, and it hasn't kind of reached that modern level yet.
Agreed.
So today we really want to talk about male suicide, especially in how there's just such a dramatic difference between male suicide and female suicide rates in the UK and in the Republic of Ireland. So men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women, and in the Republic of Ireland is actually 4 times more likely. So it's just such a dramatic difference in those levels. And why do you actually think that is?
So there's been a huge amount of work, I guess, in this area, and I think it's fair to say it's very complex, and there's a lot of factors. But one of the factors I think that we can tangibly look at and potentially change is the kind of cultural expectations and cultural factors around what a man should be and how a man should be in modern society, because it's an area that is definitely, you know, it really is playing a big role into why we see that men often take, you know, well, in terms of suicide, often more violent forms of suicide. The attempts versus the rates of suicide, you know, they generally take less attempts before they manage to die by suicide. It kind of gives you, I guess, an indicator of that maybe there's a real difference between men and women, and why that might be. When it comes to I think the stigma side of things, I feel that's a really big issue still for men in particular. And if you think of like societal norms and maybe culturally, the British culture of like a man should be like stoic, resilient, bullets bouncing off them. Men don't talk about feelings. You know that showing emotions is a sign of weakness. This is actually real stuff that people have kind of been passing down the generations, you know, for a long time. And although I think we're making really good progress, that stuff doesn't dissipate overnight. And I think you still see young people coming through with that feeling that they must be stoic, they can't share. And actually, you know, looking at what happened to my brother, you know, he never said how he felt. He never reached out at all to anyone around him. And I think there's obviously a huge conversation around things like funding, and, you know, we want to see CAMHS funded better, psychiatry, mental health as a whole. You know, I'm with you. I'm with you all on that. But if people aren't feel able to reach out, then even the best funded services in the world can't save them. And in my brother's situation, unfortunately, he didn't feel that he could reach out, you know. And I think a big part of that is around this feeling of, oh, it's a shame. There's a shame associated with it, and being able to vocalize it. And I guess there's a big element, of course, when we go back to the emotional literacy and using the right words, you know, for how you're feeling, and finding the words or finding the way to express yourself. I think that's a big aspect of it as well. You know, we can't ignore the issue. I think the fact that three times and 4 times more men die by suicide, it's just shocking. You know, and we've got to think about these are potentially preventable, you know, causes of death. And I think a big part of the answer comes down to education again. You know, again, from a young age, getting people comfortable talking about the way they feel, understanding their feelings and emotions, knowing how to manage those, and feeling comfortable about accessing support, you know, and knowing where to go. Because a lot of people don't know where to go when they need help. And yes, of course, as I said, we need more funding, we need more money into it, but actually there are a lot of amazing organizations doing a fantastic job that are there to help, but people aren't aware of them. I'll take, for example, school children. The charity Shout is amazing. It's a text service that you can text in and have a response via text by someone who's trained to respond and help you through that process. Why is it amazing? Because a lot of young people don't want to pick up the phone. They don't want to go and see the teacher. They don't want to walk into the GP practice. It's a fantastic service. But if children aren't aware that that exists, they're not able to access it. So we're potentially missing out on a group of people that we can help. And that's why I think the education, not just for stigma, but helping, you know, people understand different ways that they can reach out and get support is very important. Particularly, you know, if, say, a young boy, a young man, you know, maybe if my brother, if he'd been aware of Shout that he could have accessed in a different way, would he have accessed it? I don't know, maybe, but we've got to give these people the chance. we know that some of the highest rates of suicide are amongst farming communities, and particularly farming communities, say in Wales. Look at the way that maybe that culture is. I mean, that you want to see a stoic culture and really kind of traditional male attitude to what men should be. Look at farming a lot of the time, and I think a lot of the charities, there's specific charities that work with farmers and trying to kind of connect with them, because sometimes they can be quite isolated, I guess, in their work and their lifestyle and things, and the opportunity, I guess, for expression is different. But I think looking at different parts of the country, we're in different stages, I think, of breaking it down. But I feel like in the last year, with all the terribleness of the pandemic, I think we're talking a lot more, and I know some people feel is talking the answer. I think it's part of it. And I think part of realization that the problem exists, and that why it's happening is a big part of fixing. And I think through talking and through educating people, young and old, I think that's a big part of the solution.
And our last podcast that we did was called Daddy Blues, and that was basically looking at a short film that one of our psychiatrists made called Daddy Blues, and it was about men with postnatal depression, which is obviously, it's very, very rare, but it does happen, and when it happens, it's pretty awful. And we don't speak about the mental health of fathers very often. What kind of pressures do you think there is on dads?
Well, I think if you look around, if you were to look at an area that's stigmatized, it's a really big area, that actually, you're a new dad, that you should be tough and you should be strong. And if you're affected, how can, you didn't have to have the pregnancy, how can you be finding things hard? It's the mother of the child that's gone through the trauma. There's so much kind of around that men are sometimes made, I think, not intentionally, but sometimes unintentionally made to feel, fathers, I mean, to feel that way. And when you actually look at it, it's believed it's a lot more common than we realize. I mean, Tommy's, the charity Tommy's, did a lot of research into this, and there's believed up to 1 in 10 could be affected by daddy blues, and even a severe end of the spectrum. I get labeled in that way, but in the severe end of the spectrum, the postnatal depression. And I think we need to recognise that a little bit more. That when any change, any big change in your life can impact you and in the way that you feel. And I guess if we look at it in a certain way, and we step back with this scenario for a second, imagine you've got a new job and you're moving from Newcastle down to London, you're moving to the big city. It's a great opportunity, you've got a new job, but it's a massive change. You're leaving your regular contact, probably with your family and friends. You're going to a new place that you don't know. You've got new added pressures with the stress of the job. There's all sorts of change in your life. And we know that big times where you're experiencing big change, even if it's something that's perceived to be good, can actually have a profound effect on your mental health and your well-being. And, we know those we talk about transitional points of going to school, going to university, leaving university, the job, the workplace, changing jobs. These are all transitional points. And a clearly big transitional point is fatherhood. So having a new child, the financial pressures that can come with that, the responsibility, the change in your social, you maybe not going to do the same social things with your friends that you were, you may become more isolated. It's a huge change. And I think, and I feel really passionate that we need to understand that it's fathers that are affected too. And if you imagine, even in a scenario where, the mother might have postnatal depression, that's probably going to have an impact on the mental health of that father as well. So I think it's really great that that podcast, and I think highlighting that issue is really powerful.
So just going back to education, we touched on this a little bit before. Some doctors do experience the death of a patient by suicide. Do you feel when you're training to be a doctor that there is enough education around this?
So I went to med school at Peninsula Medical School, which is now Plymouth and Exeter, the separate. And I must say we had quite a modern approach to patient interaction, into, I guess, these kind of issues. And I think we did have quite a bit of training around dealing with death, not so much around specifically suicide. And I think I've actually been speaking quite a lot with med students across to, various medical schools. And I think the general consensus that we probably need to do more around mental health. And, a big part of a big part of, I guess, the misconceptions around being a doctor is that, oh, it's just psychiatrists that deal with mental health and GPs. A&E doctors, I'd say, I was shift the other day, I'd say half the patients I saw had either the presenting complaint was related to mental health, or was a significant component of why I was seeing that patient. And even if the presenting complaint, the reason they're there isn't about the mental health, often it's tied in. So if someone comes in with a heart attack, they've had a cardiac incident, they've had a myocardial infarction, it may well be that the problem is physical, but the impact on their mental health could be huge. And so that connection, I guess, between the two, and I do feel that it's important that we're trained properly and prepared for that, to realise that the two are so interconnected. When it comes back and we loop back round to talking about suicide, I don't think we do enough. I think we probably should do more and preparing, because it's such an emotionally difficult situation. I have seen a few patients who've died by suicide, either before or at the time they presented to the A&E department, have been brought in by the ambulance, and it's really traumatic. It's really, really hard, and it's something that we all, I think, find really difficult to kind of get over. And I think something really important that we've kind of learned is the importance of realizing how tough it is, and talking, and we've been debriefing, and I think we're getting better, certainly, at dealing with traumatic situations like that. But we need to do more. I think that's, especially for new doctors coming through, I think it's a real shock when it happens.
Absolutely. I don't think there's anything that can, maybe there isn't any amount of education that can actually prepare you for it happening.
Yeah, I think to me, it's more about how to deal with it afterwards, and the kind of looking after yourself and debriefing more than prepare. I don't think anything can really prepare you for that fully. I think you're only human to be shocked by it and be upset by it, but it's how you handle that, knowing who to go to in the department, how the department's going to handle that situation happening, what the debrief process is, what your support services and counselling services are available to talk about that. A big thing, particularly in the last year, we've seen so much death. I mean, there's no two ways around it, right? It's been really bad, and in that sense. And I think now more than ever, we've actually realised how much we need to care for our staff, and look after our staff. And I think being aware of where to go when these things happen, don't just shrug it off and think, what, I just need to crack on. I'm this resilient A&E doctor or doctor. You're human, and you shouldn't expect yourself to just shrug it off. It's perfectly normal to feel what you feel, and I think knowing where to go and getting support for that is vital.
I couldn't agree more. And speaking of education surrounding suicide, when do you think we can start to teach kids about suicide? Because perhaps it should start earlier than high school.
Yeah, I think this is an area that's got a lot. There's been a lot of conversation around this. I think truly the answer and the best person to answer that will be education psychologists, really looking at when the most appropriate time and age is. I'm very keen that we particularly focus around, as I said, the emotional literacy, understanding, the kind of basic principles of well-being, of what is mental health, what's mental illness, what's well-being, what's self-care, how does, and learning the principles of how someone should look after themselves. And as they get older, I think we do need to teach, because sadly, we know that 11, 12-year-olds are taking their lives by suicide. These things are happening, and so if these are happening, then we need to have the education to go alongside it. And I think that cultural change, again, I think there's been a lot of fear in the past of, if we talk about suicide, then children will take their own lives. Well, we actually know that the evidence doesn't support that theory. But there is got to be an element of bit when is appropriate. But I hope this is looked at intently over the next couple of years, because I think we probably need to review it.
This year, due to COVID, a lot of university students were very isolated in halls, and that was really difficult to cope with for anyone who's just got moved away from home. Do you think there's something that universities could do to reach out to students and make them feel like they're included if there is kind of like another pandemic or another form of this kind of grand isolation that happened last year?
I think I've done a lot of work with universities over the last year, and I speak to as many as I possibly can as students, and it is a group that I've really been worried about, to be perfectly honest, because and then actually when we looked, and I was working kind of with number 10 around this at like the groups that have disproportionately been affected by the pandemic. I think no one would argue that students are certainly among that group. They're young people often that have been moved to a new area that they don't know and maybe don't even have friends yet, especially they're starting at university, and they're isolated in often accommodation and things. And I think that's been so hard for them. And I think we shouldn't for a second ignore that. I also do think that a lot of universities did, some made mistakes and I think errors have been made, but I think a lot of universities they've really tried hard to support their students in what is really a very difficult circumstance. And I think one of the things I have heard is that students would like to be included amongst communication and decision making more. And I think that's something a lot of universities agree and accept. I think it's an obvious point that if we're looking at the welfare of students, let's involve the students in the decision making in that process, and I think that'll be I hope if God forbid we don't go back to one of those situations, but I think that should be something really considered as time moves forward, for sure.
Yeah, I definitely think if you're sitting alone in your halls and you're having all your decisions made for you and you're feeling extremely isolated, you would feel like you've lost a lot of control.
Yeah, I think that's a huge aspect. I think a lot of us feel that way about control, but particularly if your movements are controlled to that level. And yeah, as I say, I really feel for students through that, and what they've been through has been really tough. And that's why I spent so much time actually talking to students around, what to do, how to cope, how to look after themselves through those times, where they can go, what sort of support services have been. I've tried to kind of speak to them as much as possible to kind of get that message across, to see what can we do more to support them, and also what's available. I'm really passionate about making sure that access to support should be easy, it should be drop-in, it should be available to anyone that needs it. And one of the projects that I'm working on in my role with the government is I'd really like to see early support hubs set up across all communities across the UK. And this is a project that I'm working on in collaboration with the whole mental health coalition, including all the charities and everyone that's involved in the mental health coalition. And what we're calling for is the government to fund the hubs. So these would be for under 25s, walk-in service, whereby you'd self-refer, you'd see a youth worker who would go through why you're there, what things are going on in your life, and then they would be able to triage you almost into the appropriate support. So having access to counselling therapy, talking therapies, educational advice, career advice, citizens type bureau advice, even sexual health we're considering would be an important aspect. So a wraparound service. And I think we know from comparing to other services that are out there already that the evidence is really good. The YX Youth Access model, which is similar in certain parts of the country, has an efficacy, an improvement rate of psychological distress improvement of around 60 to 70%, across the board for those who present, which is actually really good when you compare it to other interventions. And so, I think when we move forward, we need to think about these community-based things that, that provide support to all people. But even, especially universities, that could be a really important thing moving forward. Those students that have been affected, they need somewhere to go that they can walk in a place that's not clinical, they're not going to be judged. Of course, they can reach out to the university, but some people don't feel comfortable doing that. And I think that's why something like this project, I think, could be really powerful.
I feel like the concept that you're speaking about there of self-referral is also really important because it brings the control back to the service user. And it also means, we know when our own mental health is severe enough to need to speak to someone. And sometimes it shouldn't have to be left to seeing a family GP. And some people have known their GPs for a really long time. And they actually just want to take their mental health into their own hands. So I really like the concept of self-referral there because it brings kind of back the power.
I think so. And I think the other aspect as well is that even looking at GPs, I mean, the other flip of the coin is that, for GPs, they of course can refer to services, but a lot of people in the early stage with emerging maybe mild to moderate mental health illnesses or needs, that might not be the appropriate place to send them. And therefore, if you refer a young person to the CAMS service, child and adolescent mental health service, it might not be the appropriate place for that person at the time. But if we can intervene, at an earlier point and in a wraparound service that is much more immediate, that could actually, for some people, prevent them requiring such, those services. And I believe that is an area that we really should look into. Of course, CAMS, the child and adolescent mental health services were developed and designed for the 5%, right? It's not designed for the 100% that's currently been sent at them, and I think that we can't always expect those to fix everything. We need to look at the community as a whole and look at how various services can plug in and actually help different people at different points in their life, really.
Yes, it's not a one size fits all.
No, absolutely not.
So bringing it back to you, how do you personally look after your own mental health?
I think it's been something that's become more important, I think, over the years. I first experienced, I guess, some difficulties in my own mental health when I was at university. I became quite lost within myself. I lost interest in studies. I stopped eating well. I was sleeping terribly, wasn't exercising. I recognised that I was going into a place, really. Luckily, I spoke to my mum. Actually, it was a fantastic source of support, as other mums are, and she helped me kind of direct me into the right kind of support and direction, which made a huge difference actually to my own mental health. And that was my first interest, I guess. And a lot of the ways that I felt better was actually by practicing, I guess, the well-being that we talk about. And I think for a long time we've underplayed rather than overplayed the impact and power of what we can do in each day. I think we've actually gone, going for a walk, how does that help you? Actually, I feel very strongly that the small changes individually, where they can add up and make quite a significant difference. I mean, if you look at the treatment for most mental health illness, an element of lifestyle change is in almost every single one. It's not just down to just one treatment, it's the combination. So what I mean by that, I guess, for my own, like now in my own life, I look at everything in my life and how things can impact. So am I sleeping well, or am I run down and tired, and that's going to affect my mood? Am I eating well, providing energizing my body throughout the day, not having peaks and troughs of energy will affect the way I feel? Am I getting enough natural light? Have I gone for a walk to be around nature and have that calming effect? When's the last time I did some exercise? And what I've tried to do is build in my routine, in my day, all those components. When I get up in the morning, first thing I do is go outside, have a walk. And the benefits for sleep, circadian rhythm, morning sunlight's great for setting a circadian rhythm and sleeping in the evening. Going outside and moving is also movement, we know, is great for mood and for calm, being around nature, and then during the day I make sure I have breaks. If I'm working from home a lot, I'm having breaks to again move and get up. I practice self-care because I make sure that each day I do something I enjoy. I love my bath bombs, which people might find quite funny, but it's great for me because it makes me stop. It just chills me out, puts some music on. It's a really good unwind technique for me. So if I've had a stressful day, I do that. I talk a lot as well. I speak to my family, speak to my friends, speak to my girlfriend. And all those aspects, I guess, come to play. And they all seem as little small things. But if I stop doing all those little things, I notice a huge difference in the way that I feel. And I'm not saying these things are there to cure illness. That's not what I'm saying, of course. But are they an important part of your general well-being? I think so.
Yes, I agree. I love speaking to my mum and dad. Like daily life would not be the same. And they're both occupational therapists, so that's also very, very handy as well.
You sound advice.
Yeah, exactly. Very practical advice.
Yeah, I'm sure.
The theme of this year's World Suicide Prevention Day is creating hope. And it's creating hope through action. So how can we create hope within our own communities on a small level?
Yeah, and I think this is something I'm really passionate about. I think talking about mental health is very important and raising awareness in the day, but it's also about tangible action. I think it's something, we can all do something, I think, that can help this movement of improving the country's mental well-being and health. I think we can all do something, and even if it's big or small. I'll take for an example what we're doing at A&E in Lewisham. We have one of the consultants is going to be the wellbeing champion for the department. I'm not being the champion because I can't take on any more roles at the moment. They're the wellbeing champion, and then we're having mental health first aiders as we've got volunteers who are obviously working in the trust who are going to be mental health first aiders, and between them they can be running wellbeing sessions, thinking about creating a wellbeing room, looking at staff wellbeing as a whole, campaigns to signpost for support networks, looking at the working environment. So what we're talking about is individuals that are actually trying to do a little bit, even if it's just something small, to help that community. So if you take that example and look at any stage you're in life, whether it's school, university, what can you do to get involved in a project that helps, both your mental health and well-being, but the well-being of people around you? It may well just be being more aware at work, to check in with people or check in with your colleagues. The Ask Twice campaign, Time to Change, we ask people, how are you today? British answer, yeah, I'm fine. Take that moment. If your gut instinct is that, and the cues and social cues and behavioral cues make you think, oh, they're not themselves, take action and ask them in a time and a place that's appropriate. I get the feeling that you're not yourself. Are you sure you're okay? Because it's amazing how often in my working day, I notice that we don't check in on people that much. It's not about running around all the time and checking in, but when's the last time you asked your colleague that you sat next to how they're really doing and what's going on in their lives? So there's lots of little ways you can do it. Just think of an action that you can take, a tangible thing that you can do that might help yourself and other people from that day.
Yeah, it's a bit like what we were talking about before, is new dads thinking that they have to be a big breadwinner. I imagine that people who work in the health sector, think they have to be really strong all the time, mentally and physically. Like, they probably think, I can't get sick, I can't, do you know what I mean? Like, I have to be strong because I'm in a caring role, I'm in a care and giving role.
Yeah, and this is something that's huge, and I think let's be honest, it's a problem amongst the NHS, and we are seeing huge and rising rates of burnout, and amongst all the whole spectrum really of healthcare providers and health professionals within the NHS. And I think we need to really wake up to what's happening and realise that we need to look after the carers. We've got to care for the carers in order for them to be able to perform their jobs well. And so in some sectors of, say, medicine and some sectors, rates of burnout are up to nearly 80%, as believed, which is huge, which is absolutely huge. And for the workforce and for provision, even forget the human level, even for providing and doing the work that we're doing, it's a real worry. So we need to kind of focus on that. And I hope it's another area that I am hoping to push more for, is just to think a little bit more about how we look after our staff. What tangibly can we do that will tokenism is one thing. We don't want to be tokenistic about things. We need to tangibly make a change and support people in a way that's meaningful. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and I really appreciate it. And again, thanks to everyone that's working in the Royal College, everyone that's working in mental health. It's a difficult space, but it's a really exciting one as well. I think there's going to be big changes over the years to come, and I really hope that we can really bring it forward into the 21st century.